Koube Ngaaje, Executive Director for the District Alliance for Safe Housing.
Jeanne Booth, Aging and Disability Services Division Chief at Arlington Department of Human Services.
Matt Ferranti, Arlington County Board Member. Join us in conversation.
In my 30 years working as a social worker, and the last 20 years I've worked in social services in local government in Maryland and now in Arlington County. And so one of my passions and one of my reasons for working in social services is that I've always wanted to make an impact on the community. And so there's lots of ways to do that as a social worker. You can do that individually as in private therapy, or you can kind of make it a larger, take the look deep, wider and try to make an impact in the whole community. And social services allows you to do that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's so important to get to do a little bit of both, because if you're not connected to the individuals, an individual you're trying to help change their life, then you don't know what it feels like to really make an impact. But if you aren't able to, for me at least, if you're not able to look to the broader impact, then it's just a real challenge, because even in Arlington, we're so prosperous, but we're still 20,000 people, Arlingtonians, below the poverty line. Mm-hmm. So for me, different type of work, but I started teaching in a 100% free and reduced lunch school in Houston. So I'm always coming back to that and thinking about students and young people, children who need a greater opportunity. And so as we talked, Koube, and I sort of moved on in my career, the last 10 years I've really been working at hunger and housing and education, and all for nonprofits like Feeding America and Habitat for Humanity, and then on education issues. So that's kind of been a special time to have both, to see the bigger picture, and in a lot of ways serving on the board has been great, because the scope of the whole country seems so big, and Arlington, I do feel you can make a real difference. But you certainly know hunger issues, Koube.
Right.
Yeah. So for me, my time in social services has spanned, now almost 12 years, and 10 of those years were here in Arlington as the Chief Operating Officer for the Arlington Food Assistance Center. And I come to this work in really being committed to social services because it's something that's been ingrained in me from when I could barely walk. My mother owned her own women's center when I was a young girl back in Cameroon, and sort of that spirit of really giving back to your community and starting from sort of one-on-one relationships, because that's where it really starts, and being able to do it on the ground level. But then over my career, from my time at APAC to now being the executive director for the District Alliance for Safe Housing, where we provide and account for 50% of all the safe housing inventory for survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse in the city, that I'm able to then move from looking at it on a one-to-one basis and then seeing how we can really have more impact regionally, because our services, while we are DC based, we do serve survivors in Maryland and Virginia, sometimes even internationally. So, being able to see the impact of delivering services in a way that really commits to providing dignified access, and providing each survivor, regardless of where they come from. Our topic today is No One Left Out, and being able to reach each and every single person, but doing so in an individualized manner. And then on the on the macro level, how do you then impact policy, and how do you sort of drive the needle along, making sure that you're getting the political will behind the work to do good, and really making sure that it's done in a way that's true to what each individual. And for me, you'll hear me always go back to survivor, because that's the population that I serve now. But coming from providing services in trying to address hunger, and now sitting at the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness, you realize that social services is never one issue.
Right.
It's so interconnected.
Absolutely.
Whether you're people who need housing are also looking at education is a huge barrier,
Right.
or
Healthcare.
healthcare, you name it, it's all
Absolutely.
connected. So
Yeah.
it's definitely something that's near and dear to me.
It really strikes me that if you kind of try and go back to the senses of like the day of someone who is trying to change their life for the better, and so thinking about it, where they sleep and then where they get up and what they do during the day, and that really puts it back to household by household, which I'm sure in the work that you do, Jeanne,
Right.
is a huge
Yeah.
sort of unit that we're a great way to try and attack all the different challenges that people
Right.
face.
Yeah, and having a unified or a integrated social services is really important to address all of those needs. So you're addressing the entire person and the entire household. It's really important. And taking a step back and looking at the policies and making sure that the impact, as Koube said, is addressing what we're really hoping to have addressed, and making sure that there are no communities that are disconnected from those services, and making sure that our intended impact and the services that we provide and the way in which we provide them are really getting to our goal, and making sure that no one is burdened by the way we provide services, and that everyone is equally benefiting from the services that we provide. It's really important to have that holistic approach to social services. And so it's nice here in Arlington that we have all 5 of the service divisions in one campus, so people can get their child care needs met and have their health care needs met, and any mental health needs that they want to have addressed, as well as their emergency financial assistance. And if they have aging relatives, you can get it all there as well. So it's nice to have that.
Well, I think it's
comprehensive.
I mean, just in the first few months I've been able to serve on the board, the 50th anniversary of the department in Arlington, and so quickly Anita Friedman, who leads the whole department, and has you as a great leader within her team, she pointed out when I went over just how important it is to have physically all of the services together. And I'm sure you remember Leadership Arlington, when you go in to DHS's door and they tell you they're caseworkers who work on all different challenges. If you go in and treat you as a human being, and there aren't lengthy lines, and I think that's exciting. And I also have to say, having grown up here, that there's lots of change and challenge in the District of Columbia, but it is for me, it's also exciting to see there are some real investments that are happening. Now, there's a long way to go, but there's some real investments that are happening that, at least from afar, I can see as ways that DC is integrating and working on the whole system. That may be just a lucky view from at the moment, but it does seem as though some of the work on housing and there are hopeful signs, at least sometimes, at least from my perspective, in DC.
Absolutely, and in DC's I think DC, Maryland, Virginia, and Arlington, and we're all so close to each other, yet so different that it's impossible to not take a regional approach, but then still being able to address the unique needs of the populations that are in each jurisdiction.
Right.
And in DC, there is a lot of really great things happening, really trying to look at coordinated entry and making sure that the different departments are working seamlessly together. For me, in our organization at DASH, where we sit at the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness, we know that domestic violence is one of the leading causes of homelessness, and 1 in every 4 women and 1 in every 7 men will experience domestic violence in their lifetime, and that's one of the leading causes of homelessness. So it is impossible to address homelessness if we're not addressing domestic violence. And so in knowing that, we partner, very, very closely with all the agencies across the board, from mental health to education, because there is no typical survivor, right? It could be anyone. It could be anyone accessing any one of those services. So working very closely with the Department of Human Services, the Office of Victims and Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants, and again, mental health and the education system, really going out providing technical assistance and training to these different organizations, and then also bringing that information to the other side, not just on the social services, but then bringing that information into businesses that we partner with, and even on the government side, so that there is that crossover of information. And again, we're making sure that no one gets left out, because it's not always the individuals and members of who are on the lower end of the economic scales who are in need of services being able to address the needs of social services for everyone.
Absolutely.
Sure. Well, I mean, it does seem as though in different fields you see ideas that are stronger. I think of AFAC, where you worked on hunger, the cross certification that happens with all the social service entities, and then, on housing first is a concept that DC and Arlington have used to vastly reduce the number of individuals who are and families who are suffering from homelessness. And those are ideas you keep wanting to think of, how are we going to push the envelope to work to reduce so no one is left behind. And I think that that's one of the things that I think we're lucky with Anita and your team.
Absolutely.
Because there's real leadership.
Absolutely. It's more than just a partnership with our nonprofits, and it's really about sharing the information to the betterment of the families that we're serving, because ultimately, it's a shared service delivery, and so if we could reduce the amount of time that a family has to spend addressing their needs over and over and over again, from the government to the nonprofits to wherever they have to go, the DMV, all of those sorts of things, it really does make it an easier transition for people that are just trying to stabilize and just trying to make their families' lives more successful and more stable. So it's really important, that partnership.
Yeah, and I mean, when you really go back to the fact that this is such a highly transitional area and transient area, that people move from city to city based on their needs. This is housing costs increase over time. I sit on the board for the Alliance for Housing Solutions here in Arlington County, and that is, again, that transfer of information between entities, being able to really, do that warm handoff, so that when people are, if a survivor in our case is coming from a partner agency and has already given their information, we're able to, he or she can reach out to one of our, housing resource specialists and say, I'm coming to you guys from, Department of Human Services, and we already know, you spoke with X, Mr. Smith or Jane Doe, and we're able to then help the survivor help address their individual needs. But then that same type of transfer of information is not just happening on the ground level between, housing resource specialists and caseworker, but then organization-wide, where you sit in coalitions. And our organization is part of the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, that brings in different organizations that address domestic violence, from housing to legal to language services, and then culturally specific. That's another thing we should talk about. Is making sure that we're addressing the culturally specific needs of the different populations we serve, and so that cross information sharing and the technical assistance and training that happens between agencies and between nonprofits is really crucial to meeting the need.
Well, I think it's also, in addition to the connections you need to make, I think it's really important to not see the work as static. You referred to the Alliance for Housing Solutions. I think it's important to name that housing has been a challenge for a long time, and affordable housing has been a challenge for a long time, but it is perhaps more acute. You're now seeing a national recognition that this is both a real challenge on the rental side, but so many middle-class individuals are having struggles. And so I think it's important to know and to understand that, there may be challenges where we always may be struggling to make sure everyone is part of thriving, but that doesn't mean that there aren't more acute challenges that come up. And certainly on the issue of domestic violence, there's several organizations that work on it in Arlington, but over the Doorways has done so much over the last few years, and I think it's important for us to understand that a lot of Arlington is thriving, but be honest about the challenges that are there, because I think there are moments we're not at our best as a community when we don't see and understand the 8.2% of our community that's below the poverty line, and then those who are above the poverty line who are desperate need too.
Absolutely. Those living in near poverty in Arlington County, the Department of Human Services serves 50,000 people in the course of a year. So Arlington County, with 227,000 residents, we know that some of those folks are near poverty. They're not living in what the federal government has determined is the level for poverty, but they're struggling and they still need access to those services. So it definitely does expand beyond what traditionally people consider somebody who is in abject poverty.
Yeah, and certainly for seniors.
Absolutely.
The other, I was on Friday night at Arlington Neighborhood Villages, and they had, that didn't exist 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think as a society, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, and so isolation, we know there's lots of research that talks about the impact of isolation on folks as they age and how detrimental that can be to your health and to access to resources. But isolation for different communities of different ethnic populations that are feeling disconnected and feeling like they cannot access services is also a real challenge and has a real health outcome detriments when people are isolated and not feeling connected. And so we know that here in Arlington, we're looking at, again, I said it a little bit earlier about which communities are burdened and which communities are not connected, and how can we reach out to them and make sure that they feel welcomed in our services. And it's similar to DC. I think that the populations, the demographics are similar, and so there are some shared challenges with that.
I definitely would agree with that, and that's a particular topic that's near and dear to my heart. I'm an immigrant. My family, I was born and raised in Cameroon, West Africa, and so I know for a fact that there's a lot of communities that are fearful to come forward and access services because, again, there is this sense of isolation, but there's also a real sense of fear.
Of fear, absolutely.
And there's also a sense of lack of trust, and so how do you tap into the resources and, again, culturally specific resources that are available where you can go to someone and say, okay, well, in order, they're more likely, he or she, whomever they may be, whether they're an elder or someone who's a little bit younger, is much more likely to come forward and access services if that information is coming from someone that they trust. And, how do we eliminate barriers that are within our system, intentional or not intentional?
Yes.
And to your point of sort of holding up the mirror to ourselves and saying, well, is what we're doing still working, and how can we be better? Not from a deficit stance, but really from, how can we better empower ourselves and how can we best serve the needs of our community, knowing that the face of our community is constantly changing and that we have to be just as nimble in the response to that changing community.
Well, and perhaps nowhere more powerful for the next decade to sort of address that question than in the census that will be happening over the next now 11 months before April 1st, 2020, because you can have a well of compassion. You can have so many well-meaning people, but if there isn't a movement towards the details of making sure that everyone is counted, then I think we know from the homeless service area, that we won't reduce the numbers if we don't have that cross communication between AFAC and the department, the DHS, and there's a direct certification component that's there. So I mean, the census has been so much on my mind because it's so critical that everyone in our community is counted, so that they can have an opportunity.
Absolutely.
Everyone can have an opportunity for those benefits. And I do think, as you think about the different neighborhoods and then microculture, the different cultures in Arlington as a whole, and then the different cultures in different parts of the county, that we have a responsibility, all of us, to reach out and make sure that everyone is welcome, and that we're listening and really operating from an open heart, but also welcoming everyone so that we count everyone for our community and really DC's community's future too.
And I think just to piggyback on what you were saying about the census, it really helps us drive our service delivery because we have to ask three things. How much do we do? How much are we doing for the community? And in order to know that that's impactful, we need to know who is our community. So really getting a clear understanding and a clear count of who's living here. So we ask, how much are we doing? Are we doing it well? Because that's important to know that you're providing good service. But then the third question that the department is asking is anyone better off? And more than just is anyone better off, but who's better? Is everyone better off? And it's back to that whole no one left behind, is that we're making sure that we're penetrating the entire community and that no one is left out. And so I think everyone strives to ask those three questions, but you can only ask it if you really know what the number is that you're trying to reach. It's very important.
Sure, and I mean, I was so pleased as I started to see that metrics were such a key part of what our department as a whole does, so I think that's so important. It was very important in our budget decisions as we were seeking to fund, and it's also key to another component of what I care about, which is, and hoping to work on, which is child hunger, because AFAC has shown need increase over the years, but it's also, for me, I want to get in. If you look at different census tracts and neighborhoods, there's wide disparities in health outcomes and disparities in need, and so on my mind, not every night, but 3 or 4 times a week is there's those 3 census tracts that have significantly more need, and that doesn't mean that there's not need everywhere for individuals with disabilities and seniors, but it's really on my mind how those 2 or 3 census tracts can we help, because that's how we'll really reduce that number of 20,000 who are below the poverty line. And there's even a new initiative, which we can talk about, 200 families, bridges out of poverty, which is really trying to take the housing first integrated model and apply it to poverty as a whole, which I think is exciting. And there's certainly plenty of work to do out there if you have endless energy. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I do agree that the metrics are much needed, and it's what happens after the metrics are collected.
Exactly. Driving policy, driving service delivery.
Right. So how do we do so, and how do we do so in a way that's also compassionate?
Yes.
I always strive, for me and how I work with my organization is how do we strike the balance of people and numbers, right?
Yes.
Absolutely making sure that we're, every decision that's made is made based on what do we need and what do our people, our survivors, our board, our supporters, our partner agencies, and how does that affect, what are the numbers behind that? How does it affect our bottom line? How are we going to be sustainable in addressing that need? And so when we do the census, how do we then build the political will to then address what happens, or the trends that are shown from the census, and saying, yes, we've seen that childhood hunger is one of those things, or we know that homelessness has been a huge issue for many years, and how are we going to strategically plan to address it, and do so in a way that leaves no one behind, knowing, again, in full transparency that, yes, we've made a lot of great strides over the years, but it hasn't been equal strides for everyone. And so how do we, sort of bring that to the table and address it in a way that's meaningful, but that also, really addresses the needs of each individual population. And sometimes that means going to the population themselves and having them drive that process.
I was about to say that.
And
engagement.
Engagement. And for us, we at Dash, and we always, our tagline is home means safety, and we really strive to, through all of our programs that provides emergency to transitional to permanent housing options using a housing first model, but not just a housing first model, but a domestic violence housing first model, where we, each program is specifically designed to be low barrier and trauma informed and voluntary, and that, services, you opt into services. It's never required for you to participate in any one in order for you to become housed. But then also providing the financial services that go along with that. But a lot of that information, how that entire model was designed, was based on feedback from survivors, right? They were engaged in what do you need, and that's an iterative process. And as we grow as an organization, always going back and having our programs and our processes really be survivor led. So because at the end of the day, whether it's a survivor or it's an elderly individual or an immigrant population, whomever you're talking to, they know best what they need. And it's one thing for the three of us to sit down and say, okay, well, you need to do this, and we think you should do that. But we will never know as intimately as that particular population what their needs are. So I really always advocate for, really making sure that whatever program, whatever initiative, that the voices of the people who are going to receive those services are driving that process.
Absolutely. I mean, for the phrase that comes most to mind in that one at this second is the disabilities communities. As I worked in education, simple phrase that when I started teaching, we did not know what students with disabilities were capable of. And in the last 25 years, we've seen so much in the phrase is nothing about us without us.
Exactly.
And I think that's so true in any community. And of course, this moment, these last couple of years, I've really been thinking a little bit more about that as a white guy who's got to do more listening and no mansplaining. And I think it's
Thank you. Thank
got
you,
a lot of work to do on that. But I do think it's at every level that listening to then get to action that is focused on the hopes and dreams and desires of the individuals who are there. It seems really important to me.
So it's the empowerment. How do we help people self-advocate? I think Arlington's a great community because people can just reach out and connect with the county board, and that's a really wonderful thing. They need the confidence and the encouragement to have that advocacy role. We need to listen. We all need to listen, not just white guys. We all need to listen. And I think that we're doing a better job as a community. I think we are. We understand that now in a different way.
Yeah.
So that's exciting times.
It does feel as though we need to keep doing work, though, to kind of get to everyone. As the traditional Arlington discussions are north-south, and the more you learn, there is so much that is together. And so I guess it's lucky to get to work on these issues. I think the more you work on them, the more you feel serving other people is an opportunity in addition to a work. So
this has been great.
Absolutely. And then the last thing I would add is that I love that you said that it is all about empowerment. It's something that we at Dash believe very deeply. No matter, our mission is to provide housing for survivors in need. But at the end of every single interaction that we have with a survivor, we really hope that they walk away after receiving two years of free housing, that they are empowered enough to make those decisions on their own and for themselves. And it's only through those really intentional conversations and helping people to advocate for themselves, knowing that again they are the author of their own lives.
That's right.
That we're able to really make sure that no one gets left out. So I appreciate this
Absolutely.
conversation, and I'm going to take this forward with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.